the growth of nuclear energy has been damaged by the Fukushima event, and who could blame countries around the world for really wanting to back off and scratch their head when they're looking at developing more nuclear plants, thinking, wow, look at what happened in Fukushima. And then also look at what happened with the flooding in Nebraska with the Calhoun plant, the Calhoun nuclear plant there in Nebraska that was, by some reports, actually flooded internally. And I haven't seen or read any stories on that lately, but it's interesting to note how that over the past few months and year, we've seen virtually almost all types of energy come under some level of attack, some level of event, like with nuclear. Like I was saying, Fukushima incident, Calhoun incident, and then there was another nuclear reactor up in Canada that had some problems. You've got coal under attack from the carbon emissions angle, and you've got, coal. You've got Obama saying that, well, you can build a coal-fired power plant, but you'd go bankrupt. You remember that quote? I know Alex has played that on the air many times. So coal has been under attack for quite a while. Remember back in the 90s during the Clinton administration when some of the best coal in the world up in Utah was completely put off limits by, I think, a national park designation. And I remember Bill Clinton going there, and he wouldn't even go to Utah to do the speech. I think he ended up in Arizona, south of Utah, to make the big speech about how that this land is now off limits for coal exploration. And the people of Utah were counting on a lot of that taxpayer money, the economic benefit of digging up coal to fund some of their education and all their state projects, things like that. So coal has been under a long-term attack. And then the other thing that I ran across is I'm studying all this about the oil in the spring of 2011. I'm studying about the Deepwater Horizon event. We got Fukushima going on. We got flooding in the Midwest with the Calhoun nuclear plant. We've got coal being attacked by, by governments and the global warming agenda. We've got one of the other things that I learned was under attack, especially with all the European economic debacle, and you've got a lot of countries that are backing away from their heavy spending habits, and one of the victims of governments backing off from all of their excess spending of money that they don't have or of overtaxation of their people. One of the victims in Europe and also somewhat here in the United States is the alternative energies. The darlings that were there, the green energies, and not that I'm necessarily a fan of them. In some of them, I think they're farcical. Some of them, they might work or whatever. But a lot of these alternative energies like wind and solar were counting on big government subsidies. Hence, we had the big Solyndra story, where they had, I think, $500,000 and it's basically evaporated and disappeared. Here in the United States with the Solyndra story, and now they're talking about, indicting and investigating the Obama administration's activities in helping Solyndra. Excuse me. So we've got a lot of these alternative energies, not that they were necessarily great or fantastic or going to save the world and all that, but it's interesting to see that it's almost like some level of industrial espionage going on to play with the supply and demand and the viability of all forms of energy. I just keep looking at the different things. You've got the wind situation with the windmills, and they're being attacked from some different angles politically to slow their progress down. So basically what the NWO has to do, it appears, is that they have to be on the ready with their attack dogs, whether they be some so-called environmental group of tree huggers that would attack an energy to slow them down and hinder them, or a Deepwater Horizon event, or maybe even now, it makes me more suspicious that all of a sudden you had these nuclear plants. You had Fukushima, Calhoun, and that plant up in Canada, like almost 3 in a row, boom, boom, boom. You really have to start to wonder, and the rumors have been out there of exactly what is going on. In the case of Calhoun plant, they said that flooding was pretty much intentionally done by the Corps of Engineers, and those reports came out. So you really have to wonder when it comes to energy, and we really have to watch in particular, because one way to keep the cost of energy low, which is really key, one of the key factors to keeping our economy at least at the level it's at. Our economy is hurt. There's no doubt about that. Our economy is hurt. It's limping along. I've driven taxis here in Austin for a long time, and we just, as a person in the transportation industry, it's almost like we've got our fingers on the pulse of the economy a lot of times, because we rely a lot on travelers coming in and out of the airport, going in and out of the hotels, convention business, and all that. And just these stories, like, for instance, this past summer with the European economies going potentially in the tank, like Greece and Italy and France, etc., just those stories hitting the news, stock market news, and all that changes the environment of the economy. So one thing I've learned over the years is if you've got inexpensive energy, if you've got cheap gasoline, inexpensive gasoline, if you've got inexpensive diesel, then that is one of the biggest factors that dictates how the economy goes. And to give you an example, actually maybe to give you maybe more than one example, 2 or 3 examples. I grew up basically and first started driving back in the 70s, and I can actually remember when gasoline was 18 cents a gallon, 20 cents a gallon, 30 cents a gallon, in that range. You know, it had the first car I had was a big Buick with a big gas hog engine, 8-cylinder engine, burning, using about a gallon for every 7 miles, a gallon for every 8 miles. And it was no big deal, though, because you could go get 20 gallons for, $5 or $6. So that was really, we just didn't know how good we had it back then. Okay, people didn't make the kind of money that they make nowadays, but that's, because of inflation. But still, filling up your tank, 20 gallons for $5 or $6. Picture what that would do for our economy right now if somehow there were a big giant rollback. I don't expect it to happen at that level. But if we could see gasoline down at the $1.25, $1.50 level, that would really be one of the big things to spur the economy. But back in the 70s, that's one of the first, I guess, in my lifetime, the first gas crunch that I can remember. There might have been other shortages, so-called shortages, prior to when I can recall, but that's the first one I remember really vividly because I was living it in the 70s. And back then, we learned that ultimately gasoline and oil were not going to be the solution to keep us being transported here in the United States. We learned that back in the 70s. That was a big lesson. And back in the 70s, we saw gasoline go from, like I said, around 18 cents a gallon, 30 cent a gallon range, up to $1.50 a gallon. And that, so taking it from 30 cents to $1.50 was a 5-fold increase, 5 times higher. So imagine nowadays where we were, like in the, I guess about a year ago, we were around the $2.50 range. Imagine if they had taken it from $2.50, 5-fold increase. Imagine what that would have done to our economy. $12.50 a gallon. Can you imagine the shutdown that would have created? So this is that would have been more equivalent to kind of what happened in the 70s because of that 5-fold increase. So it really crunched the economy here in Texas. I don't know about everywhere, but here in Texas, we actually had gas lines at the gasoline stations. There were, the NWO had, I think, even more control, obviously, probably on gasoline and oil back then, or maybe they just haven't implemented as much control yet. They probably have that same level of control if they want to where we could have, once again, gasoline lines at the stations. But here in Texas, we actually had gasoline lines at the stations, and at one point, there was actually rationing of a sense because you could only get gasoline on an odd or even day that matched your license plate. So in other words, if your license plate number ended in a 1, a 3, 5, 7, 9, then you could get gasoline on an odd numbered day. If your license plate was 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, then you could get gas on an even numbered day. So there was a form of rationing back then in the 70s here in Texas up in the Dallas-Fort Worth area where I grew up. And fortunately, we haven't seen those types of events, at least not on a countrywide scale. I'm not sure even back then, here you most of the time you're just focused more on what's going on locally, obviously, and especially as a young man, a teenager at the time, I'm just paying attention kind of more to what's going on locally and not nationwide and certainly not worldwide. So I don't know how widespread that gas rationing was, but being here in Texas, we had some of the best supply. We traditionally for decades and decades had some of the best supply when it comes to oil and gas. So I can just imagine if we were here in the Fort Worth, Dallas area with rationing, then I'm just suspecting that other parts of the country had an even more acute rationing back then in the 70s. So anyway, fast forward though, here we had gasoline, diesel prices up over $1 a gallon for years and years and years. Once we eclipsed the dollar figure back in the 70s, we ranged up in the $1.25, $1.50, $1.30 range for many, many years. And frankly, never thought that I would see gasoline back under $1 a gallon. But, a little while ago, I was talking about how it's such a factor on the economy, price of gasoline, diesel. And to demonstrate that is we actually, believe it or not, and I couldn't believe it when it happened, we actually, in the late 90s, saw gasoline prices go below $1 a gallon. I couldn't believe it. It was literally almost like Christmas every day, especially being an independent contractor and having to buy gasoline every day. It was amazing. And think about the economy we had in the late 90s. That was one of the most popping, humming economies in the late 90s that we may ever see in our lifetime, or at least in my lifetime. Think of the things that came together. And a lot of people try to give Bill Clinton credit for the economy of the 90s. I'll tell you what, that guy, he's just the lucky guy that he was president at that time when it comes to the economy, because think of all the things he had going on starting in the early 90s, mid-90s, building up into the late 90s. You had the internet coming on. You had all that build out of the infrastructure of the internet. That still continues somewhat today, but back then in the 90s, you had fiber optic cable being laid everywhere. You had, roads being dug up for fiber optic cable, all the infrastructure for the internet. You had cell phones just blowing up. My first cell phone I had in 1997, and now kids grow up and they get their cell phone, when they're kids, and they can't imagine a world without cell phones. And now it's hard to imagine a world without cell phones. But think of the infrastructure that had to go into the behind the scenes of making the cell phone industry work, the towers, all the different wires, and as that Alaskan senator that got fired, thankfully, used to talk about the internet and the tubes. But all that infrastructure built out in, starting in the late 80s, going in the early 90s, cell phones, people getting handsets, internet, people getting PCs and computers. I didn't even mess with a computer till around 1997. I'm still pretty bad on the keyboard, even after 14 years, but here I was in 1997, would have been approximately, late 30s, early 40s, and had never really messed with computers. And here in 1997, I'm taking some of my first trips to the library in Dallas, Texas, to get on a computer there for free and working on that slow internet from the that we had back in the late 90s. So it's just amazing what happened in the late 90s. Like I said, you had the hardware of the PCs blowing up. You had the internet coming on board and being built out, and not just here in the United States, but obviously worldwide, which all that also drove the stock market bubble of the time. And then on top of that, you've got stock market blowing up and people awash in cash. You had what they call Dellionaires here in Texas, because a lot of them had stock options at Dell and had become millionaires almost overnight. It took a few years or whatever, but you had the gasoline go down below $1 a gallon, and that's where it really ramped up to just a hot, white economic zenith back in 1999, 2000. And during that time, I knew that times were pretty good. I just didn't realize how good they were and then how bad it would be to come, although I'd been listening